Okay, so we had just finished talking about the Keynesian cross, and basically talking about the difference that emerges in terms of the equilibrium and where disequilibrium is. And again, in scenario 2, that there was a situation, in this case, where planned expenditures, which are up here, always represented by real GDP, that planned expenditures were different than actual expenditures. And because the planned expenditures were greater than the actual expenditures, the only way that planned can be greater than actual, this is always planned, real GDP is always planned, the only way that planned expenditures could be greater than actual is if inventory levels are being built up, right? So they're producing more stuff than people are buying. So inventory levels rise because they're producing more stuff than is purchased. And firms react to that by stopping production or slowing it down so that they can start to draw down their inventories. Their act of slowing down production moves us first along this line. And then as they, reduce worker hours and reduce payments to suppliers, consumers then start spending as much. Over here, the actual spending is greater than the planned. And the only way that actual spending can be greater than planned is if inventory levels are being drawn down. So firms are now running out of stuff. So they start to increase their production, and then they're paying workers more money to buy more stuff. Okay, now let's look at why does this AE curve look like this? Why is it being placed right here? That leads me to part 2 of these videos, the components of aggregate expenditure. Now, we see that it's aggregate expenditures is equal to consumption, planned investment, government expenditures, and net exports. We kind of in this model had avoided net exports, but we can go back to talking about it again. In terms of consumption, so what we could start to create here, again, we know that consumption is the most important part of GDP. Well, what we know is that it depends on 5 different factors. That the level of consumption, so first that consumption, it kind of looks like this. As a general function, consumption is equal to a fixed component, an autonomous component. So even if I didn't have a job, right, I'd still have to spend something to put food on the table or for entertainment or whatever, even if I didn't have a job. So there'd be some level of autonomous consumption that does not depend on income. And then I would add to that a constant fraction of my disposable income, the amount of income I have left after taxes. This B is called the marginal propensity to consume, MPC. Of every additional dollar I have after I pay my taxes, how much of that do I spend? So that it might look something like this. I'm going to always spend $800 at a minimum, even if I have no income. And then, of every dollar I have after taxes, I spend 75% of that, or 0.75. That's what gives it a constant slope, or a positive slope. Okay, now that consumption function, that total amount of consumption, it's going to depend on 5 factors. One of the first things is, as we see here, is going to be my level of disposable income. So that's the first part. Another part that it could depend on would be household wealth. Obviously, if my household wealth is greater, I'll spend more on consumption, right? And that wouldn't be reflected in my income levels. It's just that I have more wealth. Expected future income, right? When I was a graduate student, what did I get? Something like $700 a month. I spent far in excess of $700 a month when I was a graduate student, getting my PhD. And I did that in part because, it's really hard to live on $750-some a month, but also because I knew my income would at some point be higher. and so my expectation of higher future income, I spent a little bit more back then, borrowed money with the anticipation of paying it back. Just as you're spending more than your income right now with student loans and whatnot, because you have an expectation of higher future income. The price level. Well, the price level is going to be a pretty important factor. And basically what we're going to say is that when the price level is lower, I feel richer. My income purchases more when the price levels are lower. So when the price level is lower, consumption is going to be higher. When the price level is higher, I feel poorer, so I don't buy as much. And then finally, the interest rate. The interest rate is basically what I give up by consuming, because if I didn't consume, I would save. So when the interest rate is higher, I consume less, because not only is it more costly to borrow money, but it's also very expensive to not save money. Whereas when the interest rates are low, consumption is generally higher. So those are the 5 factors: disposable income, wealth, expected future income, price levels, and the interest rates. And you'll want to be familiar with those and know how they affect total consumption. Okay, the overall function then would look something like this, where it's, in this case, if we're using this example here, it would start at 800, and then it would rise for every $1 income increases. This is going to increase by 0.75 consumption. Okay, now what we can then go from there with is this idea that the consumption is going to be added to planned investment, government purchases, and net exports. For the planned investment, there's going to be 4 factors here. The first factor for investment, and we're going to generally presume here that it's exogenous, it's determined outside the system. But for planned investment, what we're going to presume here is that it depends on 4 things. First would be expectations of future profitability. When there's an expectation of higher future profitability, we would presume that firms would be willing to invest more because they're expecting that they're going to be more profitable in the future. Whereas if they expect that they're in a dying business like Kodak, right? Kodak is not as willing to make investments because no one's buying, film cameras anymore, or not very many. Interest rates would be a second factor. When the interest rates are lower, obviously planned investment is higher. When the interest rates are higher, planned investment is generally lower. Taxes. The higher that taxes are, the lower investment will be. And the opposing way would be the lower taxes, the higher investment would be. And then finally, cash flow. Right, how much cash are you generating over periods of time? And this would then generally say that the higher the cash flow, the more investment you would engage in, right, to increase your cash flow. For government purchases, we're going to presume that that's basically, we're going to look at that in much more detail in a later chapter, in the fiscal policy chapter. So don't worry too much about that. And the same for net exports. We're going to look at that in a much later chapter, but let's focus on 3 components for that. That would be the price level in the U.S. relative to other countries, the growth rate in the U.S. compared to other countries, and then the exchange rate. In the case of the price level, we'd say that if inflation is lower in the U.S. than in other countries, that net exports would increase. That if the growth rate was higher in the U.S. Compared to, let's say if the growth rate was slower in the U.S. than in other countries, that net exports would rise because other countries would be buying our stuff. And then exchange rate. If the value of the dollar is falling, then net exports would tend to increase. So again, 3 factors. If the price level is lower in the U.S., net exports rises. If growth is slower in the U.S., net exports rise. And if the value of the dollar compared to other currency is falling, then net exports are rising. Okay, I'm going to stop the video here and then start to combine all these things back into our Keynesian cross again.